So, you want to make animatics. Making animatics, especially your first, is a pretty daunting task when looking at the variety and complexity of animatics. I've been making animatics for just over 3 years, and while I'm not a mastermind by any means, I do feel qualified to give an idiot or a lazy man's guide. All the info here is stuff that would have been super helpful to me when I just started, and is intended for someone who's never made an animatic before. Throughout this guide, I'm going to use my most recent animatic as the blueprint here, since I've got a full recording of the process. One of the most scary things to me when I got started in making animatics was programs. I saw Premiere Pro, Adobe Animate, Vegas Studio, and was super intimidated. I personally either make my animatics in Procreate or Photoshop and edit them in Premiere Pro, but I've made sure everything I do can be done in CapCut and MS Paint, or even iMovie like my first few animatics were. So you will be seeing me using paid programs here, but don't let that discourage you. I'll also be getting more into the editing aspect at the end. Alright, let's go. First, you just gotta have the idea. Grab some characters and a soundbite or song and sit down. I chose the Good Omens guys and this Descendant song. I'd say the general process of creation can be broken down into these 3 main steps. It can get more complicated, but we're going to keep it simple. These are pretty loosely taken from the actual process of an animation studio, and they keep it simple and effective. While my skills have improved, my actual process has stayed very similar, and I consider it to be very beginner-friendly. I'm going to explain my process for each of these steps with some tips I've learned since I started in 2020. Be warned, this is probably the step I have the most to talk about, as it can be the least self-explanatory. In case you're unaware, storyboards are something used mainly in the animation industry, and are used to map out a scene very simply for animators or animatic makers to reference. Now, I included brainstorming as a subcategory here, since, depending on how much time and care you want to put into your animatic, you can include or exclude it. I combine the steps here by having the lyrics to the side and drawing my ideas into the box below. Once I put all the boxes together, that'll be my storyboard, so I often rely on whatever first pops into my head. If I decide to brainstorm for an animatic before jumping into a storyboard, it usually looks something like this. Just me writing what the lyrics remind me of, usually while I'm listening to the song. This can be useful if you want to vomit a bunch of ideas without having to draw them all out. Back to this animatic, I felt that the lyrics were vague enough that I could just kind of feel the storyboard out. My storyboards are fairly rudimentary, but what's important is they get the job done. When I first started animatics, I didn't use storyboards at all, and it led to a lot of my shots looking super similar. But when I can see them all next to each other, I can clearly see if I need variety. Now, the storyboard is really what's going to decide how your animatic comes out. I knew I wanted this animatic to be fully colored, which means I kept the frames minimal in detail and animation. If we look at my Big Mess animatic, we see that the colors are super simple, but I chose to include some pieces of animation. Now, before I start drawing my storyboard, I'll listen to this song and decide where I want my image to change. This usually boils down to the scene changing every lyric, but if there's a long pause between words or an instrumental, I note that down. For this animatic, I represent where I need to storyboard a new frame with these black lines. However, this is a very simple and kind of hoping you remember stuff way to do it. A lot of my storyboards look more like this, where I clearly outline what frame matches with what lyric or beat. There's ways in your storyboard that you can indicate you want a movement. I usually do it like this for small movements. For full animation, it looks more like this, and when I want a lot to happen in just one section, I'll do it like this and make sure I remember it's all meant to be in that one section. Depending on if your animatic will have colors or a specific palette, you should color your boards. The finished storyboard for this animatic looked like this, since I knew I wanted to use a bunch of fun colors, but my Big Mess or even my old Amphibia animatic storyboards looked like this, since their palettes were super minimal. Creating a good storyboard can take a lot of skill and things like composition, color theory, and even animation. But if you're just starting out, I'd say just go for it. The act of actually making animatics helped me learn about making them more than anything else. Now that we're done with the storyboard, it's time to take it and use it in step 2. Drawing is where you make the frames that are actually going to be in the final product. I'm personally using Photoshop, though any program could do its job in this case. I previously used Procreate and PageTool for this. When it comes to scenes that lean more towards the animation side of things, I'll use something animation geared, like the Animation Assist in Procreate or Flip-a-Clip so that I can export it as a video and don't have to turn the frames to a full animation in the editing step. I'll keep my storyboard next to my file and just reference from it. For squares in my storyboard or a line in the song that'll have multiple frames in the final product, like this hand scene, I'll keep it all in a group. From here on, the simplicity of this step will just depend on your storyboard. Mine had very little animation or movement within one scene, So it's just like creating a lot of illustrations, but it could end up being more like creating a series of small animations for you. Once you're done with your frames, however many and however complicated, it's time to put it all together in step 3. I'll be using Adobe Premiere Pro here. I've also used Final Cut Pro and know that many animatic creators use Vegas Studio. These programs are paid and expensive at that, as well as a little scary, so everything I do in Premiere can also be done in CapCut, which is free, mobile, and very user-friendly. The easiest way to edit is how I started out doing it, and my first step in the process now. I'll lay out my song and drop in all the frames and just cut them to where I wanted them around the song. Getting a little more complicated, we can do what I used in my Big Mess and Tongues and Teeth animatics, which is zooms and movements. This is done by creating a keyframe. How to do this will vary on the program that you're using. Just zooming in or moving it, and the program will animate that movement for you. I'll sometimes indicate I want this movement in the storyboard, such as here, or I'll decide I want it in the editing stage. If you want parts of one scene to move separately, like the clouds in this shot, you'll have to plan that out ahead. For me, I exported each cloud with a transparent background, put them on top of the background in editing, and keyframed them individually. You can definitely get a lot more from editing with effects, text, blurs, and filters, but I choose to leave it here. Now, just export that as an MP4 and you're officially an animatic creator. Go upload that sucker where you want. If this process still seems super intimidating, I recommend just skipping steps until you feel comfortable enough to add them. My first 2 animatics had no storyboard, and I only began using keyframes in my editing last year. The best way to learn is to just dive in and let yourself be inspired by the creators that you love. I hope this helps anyone hoping to make animatics. I may be making more non-animatics, me talking videos in the future alongside my animatics, but for now, here's everywhere else you can find me.